So both sides can inflict significant damage on the other, and neither side really wants to back down or show any weakness. And that's, I think, what we're seeing right now. It's just a bad dynamic.
We've heard a lot about the taco trade and various other acronyms. Trump is certainly generating headlines. Is that all he's doing?
Well, I'd say he's both creating headlines and he's creating some trouble for the US-China negotiations. I mean, the basic problem is that after getting to a ceasefire in Geneva a few weeks ago, both the US and China have been doing things that look like to the other side like they're breaking the agreement and trying to escalate it. So Trump is doing it. The Chinese are also doing some of that. So they're in a very bad spot at the moment in terms of actually getting to a point where they can talk seriously about their trade issues.
The Financial Times columnist Edward Luce has recently written, China is the ultimate Trump riddle. Do we have an understanding of Trump's ultimate goal here? Does Trump even?
Well, I think you have a couple problems here. Okay, so one is that I think the Trump administration generally has done a bad job of understanding where China's coming from, what they want, and what their tools are. So I think they've misjudged their opponent in this, and this has led to a lot of problems on the US side. But then, yeah, I agree. I think one of the issues here is what is it that Trump really wants? And frankly, my view on this is that Trump is himself uh, is not looking for any particular policy outcome. He's not a policy-driven guy. He's driven by money and power. And so when he gets into a negotiation, mainly what he wants is for the other side to recognize that he's really powerful, that the US is powerful, and do some displays of submission and deference. And as long as you do that, then he's happy. And it really doesn't matter how this connects to policy. And the problem is that the Chinese are not going to play that game. They're too big. They've got too much of their own face on the line. They're not going to give him what he wants in terms of displays of deference. So then it comes down to policy discussions. And again, they have a very high bar. And I don't think the Trump's team is really all that well prepared.
Are China and the US on a level playing field here?
They are in the sense that both the US and China can do a lot of things to hurt the other side. So they're a level playing field in that they're both heavyweight boxers. They're in the ring, they're pretty evenly matched, and they both can land big punches. So, Trump can raise tariffs. He's talked about cutting off student visas. The reality is China still depends on the US for a lot of things for its own economy, and Trump can take that away. But equally, the US is very, very dependent on China for supply chains and technology through some of these, critical minerals and high tech components and so forth. Um, so both sides can inflict significant damage on the other, and neither side really wants to back down or show any weakness. And that's, I think, what we're seeing right now. It's just a bad dynamic.
So we're waiting on a phone call between the two leaders. Do you think it will materialise?
I think it probably will. I mean, clearly the United States wanted said, Scott Bessant has basically said we need to have this call. Um, the Chinese view on this, I think, is what do we get out of this call? They don't want Xi Jinping to be put in a bad position. They don't want to have a phone call that delivers no benefit to them. So I think they're being a little bit cautious at the moment. Um, but at the end of the day, I think for China, although it is willing to engage in this high stakes trade war with the United States, I think they would prefer for these differences to be managed in some way and for the temperature, both the temperature and the tariffs to be lowered. So I think in the end, they're going to have to engage. I think the question is, do we get the call by Friday, which is what some of the Trump people have been signaling, or does it take a little bit longer to set up? But I think within the next week or two, we probably are going to have a discussion because both sides have boxed themselves into a a kind of an unmanageable situation. And the only way they get unboxed is for the two leaders to talk to each other.
Is this more than a trade tariff war and becoming more about global supply chains?
Well, I mean, I've been writing for 8 years since Trump started his first trade war that it was not a trade war simply, but it was more of a technology war. And I think we saw that both in the first Trump administration, but more particularly during the Biden administration, when the Biden people were very focused on trying to restrict technology exports to China. Uh, and now I think we're seeing sort of act three of this drama, which is it has now become clear that China is not just a technology dependency of the United States. They have their own technology that they can use as a choke point. And we're seeing this, mainly at the moment in these kinds of mineral exports, rare earths and other things, where it's important to understand they're controlling not just the raw commodities, but the refined products, which involve a lot of technology to process. And China controls not only the refining process, but a lot of the technologies there. So yeah, it's very much about not just about trade balances. It's about technology superiority. It's about control of supply chains. It's about all of those things.
Do you think that Trump understands the symbiotic relationship that many US tech companies have with China, especially Apple?
Trump, to be frank, has a very simplistic understanding, if you could even call it that, of international trade generally, let alone the situation with China. Um, he seems to think that, if you sell something to someone, if someone sells something to you and you give them money and all you get is the thing that you bought, that you're somehow the loser in the transaction, which is, basically nonsensical. Um, so it is very difficult to sort of make a coherent economic uh, philosophy or program out of his statements. But yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that he doesn't understand how trade and investment work generally, other than as big numbers. Um, and in particular, I think he doesn't really display very much of an understanding of the kind of interdependence between the US and China. But I would say this is more than a problem of Trump. I think this extends into a lot of people in the US elites, um, in Washington, in the foreign policy sector, who basically say that they would like to recreate a Cold War situation between the US and China, similar to the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, where they think that that's where we're headed, inevitably. But then they don't look at the trade and investment numbers, which are completely different for US China than they were for US Soviet Union back in the day. Um, so I think it's not just that Trump doesn't understand. I think there's a lot of um, muddled thinking within US elites about really, okay, you want to have a more confrontational stance with China. What is the cost of that? Right. And what is the reality of these very interconnected global technology supply chains? And I think people fantasize that you can sort of go back to an era where the US controls everything and supply chains are all localized. And that's just not how the world works these days. And it's not going to go back to working that way.
You say there's a cost to this confrontational relationship. The world can't go back. How does it go forward?
Well, it's really difficult because I think that, in fairness, there's costs on both sides, right? So I think the problem with the globalized interdependent world that we have created um, is that, number one, there are so many more technologies today that are dual use, that can be both civilian and military in their applications. You look at artificial intelligence, you look at drones, you look at all of these things. It is very hard to draw the line, a neat line between what's a civilian and what's a military product. So basically everything can be turned into a military product. And what that means is, in this world of global interdependence, no one really feels very safe, right? So that's the cost of globalization, is that we've everywhere, not just in the US, but in China, everywhere, people have lost their sense of security. So that's a cost on that side. The cost on the other side is, if you try to somehow go back to this era of every nation just producing everything for itself, you have enormous efficiency costs, enormous welfare losses. People will be poorer if you really try to go that way big time. And it's just, frankly, it's just not possible to go back absent, an actual world war, which I don't think anyone wants. So we're kind of in this dilemma where globalization seems to have its cost in terms of making people feel more insecure, but trying to turn back the tide of globalization just doesn't really make any economic sense. So how do we go forward? It's very difficult. My personal view on that is that the way forward would be for the United States and Europe and a lot of these other major markets to say to the Chinese, look, we don't feel very comfortable simply being a receptacle for all of your exports of all of this stuff that you're producing within China. What we need to have is a deal under which you do a lot more investment and localized production in Europe, in the United States, wherever. And then you're subject to our cost structures, our rules. There's some kind of local employment, there's some kind of technology transfer. And if you're investing locally in this production, then we have more, we will feel more secure because we can see how this stuff is being made because it's made inside our country and we have a little bit more control over it, right? I think ultimately that is the way that we would go ideally, but it's very, very difficult to get there because in the United States, there's now this view that any investment by Chinese companies is a national security problem. And in China, I think they would be concerned about losing control by having their companies move abroad more internationally. So I would like to see this resolved through a more sort of robust investment regime that allows for more cross-border investment by Chinese firms and in more openness by China to investment by companies from the West. But I think it's going to be really hard to get there.
And yet we're continuing to see the tariff trade rhetoric coming out of the White House. Do you think Trump will achieve his end goal of getting China to comply with his demands?
First, you have to figure out what is Trump's end goal. And the end goal keeps changing because he said we have tariffs because of trade deficits, or because people aren't spending enough on defense, or because there's too much immigration, or because China isn't doing enough to control fentanyl exports, or this, that, and the other thing. So he has to decide what his goals with China are. And I think that's going to be very hard for him to do. So I would flip that around and say the Chinese have been pretty clear that if there's going to be another trade agreement with the United States, they have to get something specific out of it. And if you look at the first trade deal that they did in 2020, the so-called phase one deal, basically China had to agree to buy a lot more US stuff and change some of its laws. And the US didn't have to give anything. So the Chinese have basically said, we're not going to sign up for another deal like that. If there's another deal, we'll do some things, but then you have to do some things. And those things could be get rid of tariffs, get rid of or reduce export controls, or open the doors to more Chinese investment in the United States, one of those things. And I think the question is, in order to get a deal with China, the US is going to have to figure out, can it give China something that it wants, right? If the answer is no, then there is not going to be a deal. If the answer is yes, then you can have a deal. But then the question is, what is it that the US can give China that China wants? That's the unanswered question. I don't think that either Trump or his negotiators have any clear idea about that yet. And it's kind of up to them to figure out, can they give China something that it wants?
Well, investors have certainly been losing interest. The taco trade emblematic of that. Should they stay interested?
The problem I had with the taco trade idea, which is Trump always chickens out, is that I think it misreads Trump's obsession with power politics, right? And yeah, he will back down for a lot of things, but at the end of the day, it is very important for him to be able to demonstrate power. And I think in this administration, he's less constrained than he was in his first term by sort of more traditional professional people. And so, what happened is that as soon as Trump was alerted to the fact that there was a taco trade on and what it meant, he lashed out and, did these other things to prove that he was really tough, right? And again, I think, the key thing, financial markets have had a hard time reading Trump because I think they're not sufficiently attuned to the fact that he's basically just interested in power, and he wants power displays, and he wants people to, to demonstrate that they defer to him. And so he will keep pushing wherever he can in order to get these displays of submission from other people. So if it doesn't work with China, he'll push somewhere else. Uh, and then I guess the final thing I would say on that is, I think the taco trade was Wall Street's way of saying, basically all of this stuff is smoke and mirrors. It's not gonna matter. The U.S. economy is going to go on. It's all going to be fine. And I think that it's not going to be all fine. I mean, Trump has made it very clear that some tariffs are going to stay, no matter what. Um, and these are going to be very corrosive for U.S. growth. They are definitely going to push up U.S. inflation over time, not dramatically. It's not like everything is going to collapse in the second half of this year, but over the next 1, 2, 3 years, you're going to see an erosion of U.S. competitiveness because of these policies. Uh, and it's going to, I think, be more difficult to justify holding U.S. dollar assets in a U.S. that is just getting gradually worse and worse because of these problems. So we should not be trading on the basis that all of this is going to go away. I think we need to be trading on the basis that this is going to stay, and it's going to have not necessarily dramatic, but certainly very significant long-term impacts for the U.S. competitiveness and its global position, and negative ones.
Arthur Kroeber, thank you.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you.